All right. Well, thanks for having me. My name is Mark Tagal. I am currently under our own banner of Tagal Oceanic. Um, I'm going to be talking to you guys about the Merroir of Ocean Farm Seafood. I don't have my speaker notes on my screen, so I'm kind of winging it a little bit, but I'm pretty sure we can kind of work through this. So, we originally applied for a grant in 2024 from the NAAEE EE Blue money, and that was a NOAA project. And the purpose of the grant was to promote aquaculture literacy. And we were going to do that through the lens of Merroir, or why seafood to taste the way it does. To secure this grant, we needed to have industry partners and we needed to have educational partners. So our first industry partners, we had four of them. The Puget Sound Restoration Fund, which operates an educational oyster farm here on the West Coast, Blue Ocean Mariculture in Hawaii, Jamestown Seafoods here in Seattle, and Ocean Era, which is also in Hawaii. They're kind of a research aquaculture operation. Our educational partners were going to be um, we got a couple of schools, public aquariums, community colleges were going to be some of our education partners. And then a lot of this is in thanks to my old employer, IBSS. We were recently suffered the effects of some Doge activities, so we kind of parted ways with IBSS, but on really good terms, and we still work with them whenever we can, but we're kind of flying under our own banner now. Some of the outreach and educational things that we were doing was the Merroir of Seafood, Rockfish Rangers, where we kind of look at rockfish conservation through restoration aquaculture, and Forage Fish Friends, which is ultimately toxicology, but I'm a fish husbandry guy that does a lot of their fish rearing. So, Merroir. Merroir comes from terroir, and terroir was originally used to describe why wine tastes the way it does. So, full disclosure, I did not come up with the term Merroir. That was a journalist here in Seattle. And they originally came up with it to describe the taste of oysters, focusing on boutique oyster farms that have sprung up all around the Puget Sound region. So, they were going to look at Merroir to describe all of these kind of individual farms and why their oysters tasted the way it did. It's not an entirely new concept for describing food. We already use those kinds of ideas when describing things like Wagyu beef or Iberian pork. Like just the name of it is gonna it's gonna give you kind of an idea of what you're getting into. And then with like cheeses, Gorgonzola, Romano, those are all from regions in Italy. So we're already looking at a sense of place to describe, why seafood tastes the way it does, or why food tastes the way it does. But when we were looking at seafood, seafood tends to get all lumped into one category. Seafood is just, well, yeah, it comes from the water. So we wanted to look at a way to describe seafood to the general public. So the first thing we did is we go, okay, well, what did people eat in the United States? And we found this map of seafood, and right off the bat, shrimp, shrimp, shrimp. Everybody loves shrimp. Shrimp is the number one consumed seafood in the United States, but for good reason. I mean, shrimp is delicious. Shrimp is also safe. Shrimp is predictable. It's relatively easy to cook. It's pretty versatile. You can do a lot of stuff with shrimp, and shrimp is abundant. So the general public knows about shrimp, and they kind of know how shrimp is going to react. But when it comes to getting outside your comfort zone, people, when cooking seafood, they're terrified to cook new seafoods. This is an article that was in the New York Times, and it talks about, kind of people's attitudes towards seafoods. If they don't know how to cook it, they don't want to venture outside their comfort zone and try something new. And a lot of seafood is getting eaten only in restaurants. So we wanted to look at Merroir as a tool to alleviate some of the fears around cooking seafood at home, ordering seafoods at restaurants, to understanding where your seafood is coming from. Um, this article goes on to say chefs know their farms, but not their fishermen. They definitely probably don't know they're aqua farmers. And so we wanted to change that. And we wanted to shed some light on different aquaculture farms in our region or regions that I'm familiar with, and use that as a way to describe seafood and to fulfill one of our commitments to the grant to promote aquaculture literacy. Then there's also this one, the kind of the anti-aquaculture. Our goal was not to take this on head on and lock horns with them. We just wanted to kind of promote aquaculture literacy and understanding. Did we change any minds by doing this? Well, we'll get to that in the end of the presentation. But if you want to fast forward, yes, through this, we were actually able to change a few perceptions on farm seafood. So we did this through our program that we were calling the Merroir of seafood. We applied mer to the term terroir. Mer is French for sea, so we're translating as a sense of place in the ocean. I'm probably butchering the French accent on this, but that's the way it goes. So we're looking at Merroir, when we're breaking it down into kind of six spokes on the wheel of how we're going to describe a sense of place from where your ocean farm seafood was coming from. You could use Merroir to describe any kind of seafood, not just ocean farmed ones. But ocean farm lends itself really well to this because you know where the farms are. So when you're talking about exact locations, it's easy to put your finger on this farm. And our ultimate goal was to promote aquaculture literacy, and so this was our avenue into that. So why learn about Merroir? We're gonna teach it as a tool for chefs and for consumers to really know how to describe their seafood, and in doing so, enhancing the dining experience, and kind of bringing forward this kind of farm to fork concept, and or seed to shuck in terms of oysters, or tidelands to table, which ended up being the title of our talk. But we wanted to really enhance the dining experience and to make it an overall positive event. On a side note, it really helped promoting marine stewardship. The Puget Sound Restoration Fund, that's one of the reasons why they operate an oyster farm, is to get people talking about oysters, thinking about oysters, and thinking about the environment that those oysters are growing in. So, a nice side benefit was promoting marine stewardship. We did it in a storytelling format, much like the way I've been talking to you guys, already. There's not going to be a lot of statistics in this. There's not going to be a lot of, hard facts. It's very informal. That appealed to a really wide audience. We're kind of going with the winning hearts, winning minds concept, and winning hearts and minds through your stomachs. Were you converting any staunch anti-aquaculture people? We can tell you a story about one of them. But the guys we were really targeting is people who may not have an opinion one way or the other about it, just to kind of inform them a little bit more about, hey, here's some of the seafood that's available in your region, and here's where it's coming from. Up here in the Puget Sound, unless you're going out and foraging for your own bivalves, they're all farmed in our area. And a lot of people just didn't know that. So using a storytelling format was how we were going to go about kind of educating people with the concepts of Merroir. Originally, we had our venues were going to be public aquariums, parks departments, a couple grocery stores. We're going to be some of the spots where we're going to do the talking about this. We were also going to target culinary professionals, chef associations, and students of all ages. When I was going to school for marine biology, I was a chef at the same time. So I did have a background in cooking, and I knew a couple chefs, and I figured I can talk to one or two of them, and we'll knock that out of, we'll get a few people. We could expose them, hopefully, to some new ingredients that they may not have cooked with yet. Help them understand the origins of like where this food came from. And then they could use it as a tool to in turn enhance the dining experience for their customers. We also were targeting the general public at some of our informal learning events. We were at like there's a program called the Dogfish Days of Summer down at one of the public aquariums. We talked about them. Um, we wanted to promote seafood literacy, in turn aquaculture literacy, connect people with their seafood, and kind of worded mouth to get us around. One of the interesting offshoots that came of this was at a school summer camp program where we're doing this training, and it kind of spun into workforce development. Um, it's kind of hard to explain the subtle nuances in the way seafood tastes to little kids, but we could talk about how seafood was grown by recreating the entire oyster supply chain with the summer camp. And so, kind of using a STEM-based curriculum, we had kids in our hatchery, and we were measuring shells and counting stuff out, and then we planted them in our nursery area, and we planted them out in their farm, and they harvested. So indirectly, we were kind of training kids 14 to or 9 to 14. Like, this is what it's like to work on a seafood farm. Um, so that's a whole nother talk that we can go into, but you can use some of these concepts to educate some pretty young minds. There was also the benefits to our industry partners. The industry partners, we would go around and say, hey, we're going to profile your farm using our Merroir wheel, and that will expose you to new customers. Um, you know, you could, maybe get some in on workforce development, but it, it turned out being just as beneficial to our industry partners as it did to some of our audiences watching. So from this point on, this is kind of kicks off for the next couple of slides of this is what it would have been like to come and see one of our presentations. And so we would start off like when you think about the food you eat, you understand, the your terrestrial proteins. They have their own categories on a lot of outside menus, but fish kind of all get lumped into one category, all in the seafood category. And so, using our Merroir wheel to describe seafood, the first thing you want to look at is, just what species you're eating. And so, the kickoff one on our Merroir wheel is species. None of these are in any particular importance over the other, but this is a good place to kind of start it all off. And so we talked about how in the United States we have a lot of different species to choose from, and to a lot of people that's a whole new thing. But if you understand what you're eating, that's going to go a long way to describing the fish or the seafood you're eating. Is it a pelagic fish? Is it a bottom fish? Does it grow fast? So the first thing when we would profile anything, when we profile any seafood, we would talk about, okay, this is the particular species that we're eating. Um, some of our Merroir events focused solely on bivalves. And so in that species was important, you look at mussels, clams, and oysters, well, they're all these squishy things that come in a shell that open and close. And to the average person, just knowing that, like, well, these guys are fairly different, that went a long way for their understanding. When it comes to some fish, especially here in the Northwest, where we have 7 species of salmonids, and it's, unless you're a real salmon connoisseur, it's, you may not know them apart. We talked about how species is important because a lot of times fish share common names. Something like codfish, you know, if you don't know the difference between the Pacific and Atlantic cod, it's probably not that big of a deal. The fillets are similar, the taste is going to be similar. But we have another cod up here called the ling cod, and that's, it's not even a codfish. And then one of the things I would talk about is going down to Australia, where like every fifth fish is called a codfish down there. So understanding what species you were eating was a great kickoff point to kind of looking at your Merroir concepts. The next thing we would look at is terrain. So when we talked about terrain or the environment, we were looking at cues that the common person might look at to see where the farm was located. Is the farm located in a river mouth? Was it a Pacific Northwest fjord, open ocean wrasse? Like all of the different environments where seafood commonly comes from, that's going to influence the flavor of what you're eating. Food was a big one. You are what you eat. So by talking about what you're farmed food was eating, you could really um, understand how it was going to taste, how it was going to look. If there was anything where we would go head to head with an anti-aquaculture person, this is where it would come up. And one of the big ones is, well, I heard that they dye salmon, and you just explain to them. You don't tell them they're wrong. You say, well, you're half right. It is added to salmon, but it's added to the food that they eat. And it's something that wild salmon would be eating. And when we were talking about shellfish in the classes, we made sure to point out that both wild and cultured shellfish in the Puget Sound area are eating the exact same thing. They're living in the exact same waters. They're exposed to the exact same plankton. And that was a revelation to a lot of people. They never really thought about it before, but then when they really, when they like, oh, hey, that does make sense. So eating a farmed oyster is really similar to eating a wild oyster. Exactly. There's not much difference. And that kind of rang with a lot of people. And if they're, promoting the aquaculture literacy, that was a great point. Benthos was a big one when we had just shellfish Merroir events, talking about where in relation to the bottom the shellfish came from. Did they live under the sand or under the sediment? Were they right on top of it like oysters? Were they oysters that were slightly suspended above it? So the benthos is a big one in describing how the bivalve was going to react. Are you going to have to deal with grit? How it's going to you know infuse the flavor into the shellfish. And then when we talked about finfish, maybe the lack of benthos would be an interesting point. Or if it was a RAS system, it's a man-made benthos. So the environment on the ground that your seafood is growing is greatly going to influence the flavor. We talked about climate in kind of where they would show up in the world. With something like Pacific oysters that have a pretty wide range, especially where farmed oysters come into play. We talked about how climate is going to influence how fast they grow, what their shelf life might be like. We also did a couple of tastings where we looked at Ceriola. One of our industry partners, Blue Ocean Mariculture, is growing Ceriola in Hawaii. People would generally be familiar with hamachi, and then we had kanpachi, and so same genus, different species, and how a temperate fish will hold fats slightly different from a tropical fish, and so where in the world and the temperature of the ocean is going to influence how the fish taste. The last one was tradition. And tradition is where you were going to get social buy-in. A lot of people wanted to support the boutique farms here in Washington when it came to shellfish culture. That was important to them. And so that you would be tradition. We have indigenous clam gardens here. We have Native American shellfish, modern shellfish growing operations. We looked at Hawaii and traditional Hawaiian aquaculture ponds and how that would um, offer the seafood a sense of place. And so that was an important kind of buy-in, and it made people feel good about the seafood they were eating. So tradition was a big one. We did this by, so we would kind of go through the wheel of what we were talking about while we were introducing the ingredients. So for example, here in this slide, you see some clams, oysters, the fish fillets are Hawaiian kampachi. So if we were going to profile one of these, let's just go with the clams in the upper corner. We would talk about what the species was. So these are Manila clams and how that would make them different from other bivalves. We would talk about the terrain that they came from. Some of the farms that we looked at were on kind of rocky beaches near a river mouth, or some of them were softer sediment beaches. We talk about where clams fit into the environment. We talked about clams going back to species. We looked at geoducks and manila clams at the same time. So they're both burrowing clams, but a different species, and those are going to give you different flavors. So we would kind of introduce the ingredients that we were talking about that day through the lens of Merroir. If we were in a venue where we could cook for them, we always, of course, we cooked for them if we could. And that now you could taste the story. You could taste what we were talking about. this oyster is really briny because, of where it grew. This one is a real subtle brine because it's grown in the mouth of a river, and so it's lower salinity levels. If they could taste it, it really rang home. When we were at venues where we couldn't cook for them, well, so cooking in Merroir, if we could cook to those particular tastes, we would always go with it. Um, Take note on the central dish there. I'm gonna go ahead and pat myself on the back. That's a dish of my own creation. One of the competitions that we'll learn about later on. This might be next year's winner. So if you're curious about it, that is a lumpia Hawaiian kampachi back loin in a beurre blanc sauce made with homemade dragon's breath algae. So all the ingredients in that were from our industry partners. In venues where we couldn't cook for them, we would send people home with recipe cards. Um, this is really interesting. This Big Brother's fried oyster sandwiches looks like that's an interesting restaurant. I'd like to go get a sandwich there. That was in our Merroir class where we did the kind of the workforce development one. We had an entirely fictitious oyster supply chain from hatchery to consumer. So Big Brother's fried oyster sandwiches is a made up restaurant. But the what we were doing is we were showing the kids like when you're farming oysters, you know, if you're bag tumbling your oysters and you get this nice deep half shell oyster with a deep cup, that might go to Madam Queen's Fine Seafood Emporium. Or if you had kind of a clump shucker is what the kids named the big bunches of them, that might go to a customer called Big Brother's Fried Oyster Sandwiches. So totally fictitious restaurant. We had T-shirts made up. We told the kids or people who would visit those events, go ahead, take one of the recipe cards home, make a sandwich. You'll get a free T-shirt. And boy, did they make sandwiches and send in pictures and collect free T-shirts. Um, and so that was a big hit. I was wearing one of the shirts one of the days to uh, one of the culinary schools we visited, and that spurned some ideas. So there someday there might just be a food truck called Big Brother's Fried Oyster Sandwiches because some of the students were really enthusiastic about that. So social media is another place where we kind of reached out to kind of get our message out there. The nice thing about social media is you reach tons of people in different audiences, and it's 24-hour exposure. We posted on the two meta platforms, so Facebook and Instagram. We posted on LinkedIn. We're now starting to post. There's a seafood lovers group on the Aquaculture Information Exchange that we're putting stuff up on. When we were working with IBSS, they were running I think it was a bi-monthly blog where it was called In Search of the Perfect Bite, and we would always feature a recipe, most of the time with Ocean Farm Seafood, but IBSS has a Oceans and Coast division, so we would any kind of food fish that they might be working with. I think a lot of the recipes are still up on the IBSS website if you want to track them down and see some of them. So social media had a big outreach and a lot of impact. But where we really hit it out of the park was culinary programs. We focused on at first a high school culinary program. Then we started looking at technical colleges and their culinary programs, and one would hear about it, and they would talk to other teachers and say, "Hey, you should have this guy come talk to your class about seafood." And so we did. We hit up a bunch of culinary programs in the area, and that's I think where we made some of our biggest impacts. When teaching these culinary programs, for a lot of these kids, it was their first time exposed to certain seafoods, um, their first time handling it, definitely their first time tasting it. By the end of the program, they they definitely desire to cook with it again. They wanted to modify the ingredients they had to their own dishes, and like I said, new restaurant concepts. There were a couple of them just they were ready to go right there. Like, hey, let's start a food truck. Let's use these kind of Merroir concepts that we're learning about as a way to talk to our audience and let's cook these ingredients in these different venues. Um, and so culinary programs were a big hit with us, and we were already lined up to talk to 5 or 6 culinary programs in this area next year, even after our grant has run out. They're like, Can you come back? Can you bring new seafoods? Can you, hey, I heard about this farm. Can you profile them and talk to our kids about it? Whenever we had the opportunity, if we could let students visit the farms, there was always a handful of them that would do it. When they would come out to the farms, they would participate in harvesting. They would see how the farm operations go. They always walked away feeling they had a better understanding of the food that they hopefully will be preparing in the future. So what kind of started out with schools and just was we were thinking it was going to be a one-shot culinary, a visit to a culinary program, really kind of spun out into a unique thing that happened, which you're going to kind of go into right now. And it came from the first school we visited. Even before we had the grant, through a Facebook post, it turns out that I went to high school with the sister of a guy who now lives in Washington, and he's a teacher down at Bonnie Lake High School, which is about 40 miles to the south of where we were. And the goal was I was going to come in and I was just going to kind of talk to his class about my experiences being in a kitchen before and kind of my new experiences as being a marine biologist. We were going to get two birds with one stone, and I was going to talk to their culinary class and their marine biology class at the same time. And we were going to talk about um, two different kinds of fish that had the same name, cod. We happened to have a lot of black cod on hand because of a culling that I was doing with NOAA when we were doing a project out with them. So I said, hey, I'll bring some black cod in and we'll cook it up in the class. And that will be the culinary side of it. And we'll talk to the biology side of it is like, here's these two different fish that have the cod name, but different fish backgrounds. And so that was going to be our marine bio course. And so we went in and we talked about how sablefish are grown in this area, how the farming of this fish is going to influence the taste, and this being a culinary class, we were going to cook some of it. So Chef Akina, who is the little brother of the person I knew in high school, he took the fish and he came up with a recipe for it, and we came up with a miso glazed black cod. And so some of the kids the whole class cooked it that day. Some of them were pretty simple, and some of them were a little more complex. So this is the miso glazed black cod with the seared skin and some miso mashed potatoes. So that was pretty good. And me and my wife Lisa kind of left that class like, wow, some of those kids can cook. I'm gonna go home and try that recipe out myself. Well, it turns out that Bonnie Lake Culinary Program has a very strong competition side to them. And so Chef Akina is really big as a teaching tool, entering his class into local culinary competitions. And they're good. They've been winning since 2017. Chef Akina was named Washington State Chef Association Chef of the Year in 2020 or 2019. So he's an accomplished chef, and he took his class, he takes his classes out there to compete. So the first step was the Seattle's Bite of Apprentice. So Bite of Apprentice is put on by the Washington State Chef Association. The thing is you put out an appetizer, a single bite. The general public is welcome to come in, and there's a panel of judges, and they judge all the single bites. I think 300 or 400 people came in attendance for this kind of competition, and there's a panel of judges. They asked us to be a part of it. They said, "Hey, this kind of Merroir thing that we did with the sablefish, you now have this grant. Do you want to be a part of our presentation line?" Because what they do is they present their bite of food and kind of the concept behind it. We're like, "Great. Well, we'd love to come down and talk about this." So we went there. We were going to talk about the Merroir of sablefish. They were going to cook it up. We were going to put it out there to the judges. So they really wanted to capitalize on this Merroir thing. So Jamestown Seafoods they were our sablefish industry partner on this. They were like, yeah, come down, visit the farm. So the kids came out, they harvested the fish, they looked at how it was grown. Chef Akina further developed the recipe. We're gonna put it out. We took it down there. The Merroir was part of the presentation. We had the longest lines of people waiting to come get this bite of fish. So I got to give my Merroir profile of sablefish to at least 300 of the general public, and they loved it. And then you can see Lisa here talking to one of the chef judges about kind of, how we sourced our ingredients. And in the background, you can see the kids led the talk there, and they were talking to the chefs, and they talked about how they executed the dish. And so Tagal Oceanic, IBSS, we were part of the greeting line concept for this culinary class. So how'd they do in this chef association event? They came in first place in the high school division. They came in third place overall. That beat out 15 other professional kitchens. And we're talking hotel kitchens, casino kitchens, professional restaurants. They came in third place overall. Incidentally, the guys that came in first place, Bates Technical College, which was another culinary program that we visited, and they won with the seafood dish. But we weren't as part of that one as they were, but we did talk to them about bivalve aquaculture, and that's what they won with. So I don't want to say kingmaker, but kingmaker. So um they won that. They could take it another step further. Kahale entered them in the Pro Start state competition, and again, the the inspiration was from an aquaculture farm in Manchester that created the appetizer. This was another one bite thing that they went out into states. They took first place in the state again with this recipe, again with the sablefish and kind of the Merroir concepts. Why did the sablefish taste the way it does? The layer of fat that it comes from, how it was farmed. That was all part of the story in presenting this. This earned him a place to go to the Pro Start Nationals. The Pro Start Nationals are invitational, so you have to win your state to go to nationals. So they were on their way to nationals. At this point, media starts getting kind of wind on this. So Noah ran an article about this high school group that was looking at a farm sablefish and creating a recipe. The Northwest Aquaculture Alliance reran the story on their media feeds. IBSS, of course, ran an article on the whole thing. So we were gathering some attention on this dish that was a sablefish dish, but its inception came from understanding the merroir of this fish, understanding the sense of place where this fish came from, and that was all incorporated into the recipe. So they're on their way. The Nationals are in Baltimore. They load up. They get ready to go. They practice constantly before they go there. They perfected the dish. Nationals, you present three courses, so it's not just your one course appetizer. But their miso glazed sablefish, that was their kickoff. In their practice session, there was now exposure to all these new industry coaches that were coming by because they were friends of Chef of the Year, Chef Ahina. We had representatives from Bar Green's Restaurant Supply. We had representatives from US Foods come in. I was always down there at practices. Well, not always, but I tried to get down there for practices. And then I could kind of give the Merroir pitch to these other people. So the as much as they were learning, I was doing the kind of Merroir exposure to other food professionals. Jamestown Seafoods, another shout out to them for being such a great industry partner in there, for providing the sablefish. Stephen Pina was our guy on the ground. He helped us out for most of the harvesting events and talking to the students. On the day that we were taking stuff to nationals, Stephen wasn't there for some reason. This guy that you see in the red hat, I don't know if you know him. That's James Parsons. That is the CEO of Jamestown Seafoods. He is the president of the Northwest Aquaculture Alliance. Personally, that fish he's holding in his hand, that's the fish that made the trip to Baltimore, or one of the three fish that made the trip to Baltimore. So again, special shout out of thanks to Jamestown Seafoods for being a great industry partner with this, really supportive of the kids and helping them all along the way. Also, another shout out to IBSS, who we were working with at the time, for allowing me the time and energy to work with them so much, even kind of outside the realm of what the grant was funding. When it came time to do it, it was live streamed. You could tell by reading the comments here that I was watching every time the fish showed up on the screen. Look, the fish is on. The fish is on. So it was really exciting. How'd they do on the national level? It wasn't just the fish, it was the overall concept. And they were going up, there were 400 people invited to this event. So there's a lot of people there. They're all high school level, but a lot of the high schools they compete with are high school culinary vocational schools that do nothing else but cook. They still made an impressive showing of making it top 20. In fact, they were 18th in the nation. So we couldn't be prouder of them. The the dish that Kahale Hina came up with for this was featured on Noah's What's for Dinner Wednesday, that sablefish recipe. You can still find it out there. If you want the recipe, drop me an email. I'd be more than happy to share it with you. And so you would think, well, that seems like a good place to end it. We'd kind of run out of grant money. What more could we do except for compete on the national level? Well, we had one more thing to do. We took the Merroir show on the road. At one of the events that we did was at a grocery store. Someone had witnessed this and they said, "Hey, have you ever considered cooking for a private supper club?" We had done a homeschool collective before, and so this wasn't that much more of a stretch. We're like, "Yeah, okay, we'll do a private supper club." Self-described by the people that were hosting this private supper club. They said, "Think the NPR philanthropist crowd." And I was like, "All right, we can go to that." So we were at a beautiful location. We cooked for this supper club. It was in Seattle. You know, the NAAE Blue Grant closes out on the 30th of this month. And so this was kind of the last cooking event we did, but this is like a great launching off point to kind of what we'd like to do in the future. So we came out, we cooked this unique dining experience to influential diners. Um, we focused on every one of our industry partners that we had. I don't have a copy of the menu here, but I'd love to share it with people. Just drop me a line, I'll email it to you. But we put out quite a spread. It was an intimate gathering. There were only 10 people. I used the best chef chops that I had to cook this up. We feel like we really highlighted Merroir concepts and all of our industry partners. We had a side by side oyster tasting of raw oysters. We had, and so with the oysters, we looked at same species, different varieties based on all the concepts of the wheel. Our next course was clams. And so we did Manila clams versus gooey duck. Both cooked the exact same style in a Hong Kong style black bean um, sauce, but two different species in the same one. So you could taste the species variation. This dish up here, that's the lumpia kampachi one again. And then, of course, our award winning miso glazed sablefish. It was a smashing good time. It was a really good event. Um, at this one, we got the most direct feedback because we could be talking to the diners the whole time. It was great because our original thing was to expose diners to new seafoods, and that's exactly what we did. Some of the diners there said, "Hey, I had always wanted to try this, but I never did. I was always afraid to try to cook it, but you kind of talking through how to cook it, I'm going to go ahead and try this with this other recipe." There was a willingness to retry seafoods that they had previously not liked. One of the customers said, "Yeah, one of my neighbors gave me a gooey duck. I didn't know what to do with it. I just, I put it on the barbecue. They didn't even clean it and said it was awful. I'm never eating gooey duck again." We showed them. We talked about where it came from. We showed them how to clean it. We showed them how, when we connected them with their seafood. So we exposed people to seafoods they weren't even aware of, and they tried it. And this is where we changed some beliefs in aquaculture. There were a couple of people here that were like, "Well, I only eat wild salmon." And we said, "Hey, that's great. There's a lot of wild salmon to choose from." But they said, but like looking at these oysters that we're eating, these clams, these are all farmed. I said, "Yeah, they're all farmed. If you buy them in the store, they're definitely farmed. If you go out and dig your own gooey duck, that may or may not be seeded out there. But if you buy it in a grocery store, it's farmed." I said, "Oh, that's well, I guess farm shellfishes are okay." And then surprisingly, by the end of the night, "Hey, do you know of any good farmed salmon?" And so I said, "Hey, I tell you what." you guys, we came to this group through a grocery store called Town and Country. I just happened to know that Town and Country has a really good farmed steelhead. I said, hey, next time you're at Town and Country, check out that farm steelhead. It's good. I guarantee they're gonna love it. So we swayed perception of some anti-aquaculture people. We exposed them to a different kind of aqua. They never even thought of shellfish as being farmed before, and so we feel like we accomplished our task of maybe changing some beliefs. We hit the two target audiences we wanted to hit. So we wanted to expose the casual diners to seafoods and explain to them where they came from to give them a better understanding of the seafood and to enhance their dining experience. And we wanted to connect to chefs. So I don't know how good you guys are sleuths are seen in pictures. This was our private seafood event. Uh, if you look closely at all of our slides at the culinary school, you will see this gal show up in it. We met her at Bates College at one of her events, and we took her under her wing because she forced herself under our wing. She's like, "Look, I love this concept. I want to roll with it. I want to open up my own restaurant. I want to serve fusion seafood, and I want to follow you guys along for the ride, and use kind of Merroir as a concept to presenting my seafood." So we hit both of our audiences. We hit the general public and we hit emerging chefs. They now have a new tool to describe their seafood. They have a new lens as a way to look and pick their seafood, and they have a better understanding of aquaculture seafoods. That's what we set out to educate people on, and we feel like we were successful. So, what comes next? Cookbooks are nice. I Sea Grant, they put out a lot of regional cookbooks. For that last event, we threw together a real quick Merroir cookbook for the diners to take home with them. Our goal, if we can find funding from it, would produce, profile more farms, pair those farms up with now our new bullpen full of emerging industry professionals, and come up with a Merroir based cookbook. And then we, of course, would continue teaching and we would teach the cookbook. So that's kind of where we want to go with this, showcasing the merits of ocean farm seafood. So that's my talk. Thanks for listening. I'd love to take any questions.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, and thank you, Lisa, as well, for helping to make this happen. Um, just really quick, I realized I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning of the talk since we just jumped into it, but I'm Joe with the Aquaculture Information Exchange, which is the all-in-one platform for the American aquaculture community. Yeah, really grateful to Mark for doing this presentation. Like you said, we had just started this seafood lovers group that sort of came out of our conversation of doing this talk, as well as conversations I'd been having with other members. I dropped the link for that in the chat, but I also wanted to share the recipes thread in there. I just posted one of the recipes that Mark referenced, and I think Bree shared the link to in the chat. But we would love for y'all to share your own seafood recipes in there. But yeah, we have about 10 or so minutes left if anybody has questions for Mark. Go ahead, Sebastian.
Hey, good afternoon. I was a little late here, but what a fabulous presentation. And I guess my question to you, Mark, is how do we scale the kind of things that you're doing to a national level? What does it take? How much money does it take? How do you build a program around that? I mean, I think that's exactly the kind of thing that we need to do to begin to turn the tide from an opinion point of view and address some of the concerns in the public perception around aquaculture. Brilliant program, by the way. I love it. Really good.
Yeah. So the EE Blue grant was a micro grant. It was pretty small. I mean, ultimately it was meant to do like 4 presentations. Fortunately, IBSS kind of let us run with it, and we were able to do about 20 of them. Right as we were finishing up with this, we saw a notice for funding for seafood marketing for Sea Grant. And so that's kind of where the idea of the Merroir cookbook came about. we could look at doing this, regionally, like, it's kind of a West Coast, profiling West Coast farms, or profiling, the American Southeast or Hawaii. So we looked at it in terms of partnering up with producers, kind of Merroir profiling what they were producing, and then pairing them up with a chef to tailor make these recipes, and scale it up. So we had applied for that grant from Sea Grant, and then kind of the world changed with this new administration, and we're not sure where Sea Grant funding is with that. But we are still looking at other avenues to kind of further develop a cookbook, profile more farms on a bigger scale, and then teach to the cookbook to reach larger audiences. One of the kind of the college level culinary programs we found to be really receptive here, in Washington anyway. We're looking at culinary programs in Hawaii. I'd be more than willing to go teach this up and down, the West Coast, or whoever would come listen to it. Um, and it just involves kind of going out, talking to the farmers, talking, like, kind of looking at that Merroir wheel. It's like, hey, so, like, let's talk about your whatever it is you're growing and how it fits into this, and how that's going to in turn influence the flavor. And then by giving your downstream audience an understanding of where the food is coming from, you can then cook to the strong points of those flavors, um, and you can enhance the overall dining experience for the consumers. And so that's kind of where we want to go with it.
What did the existing project, Mark, cost? What was the total cost on your existing?
So the original grant from EE Blue was 20,000. IBSS was generous enough to probably contribute another, 20 to $30,000 worth of my time to do this. And then a lot of it was just done out of kind of the love of, I mean, you guys have been listening to me for last hour. I can get on a roll and talking. So, if somebody wants to listen to me, I'll come and talk to them for free. So, but what we applied for for the Sea Grant funding, I think our ask was, their minimum on that one, which was 250,000. So, and from that, we'd kind of done some of the legwork of what it would take to get a regional cookbook produced. I had talked to Sea Grant in San Diego that produced a similar cookbook that was showcasing the seafoods, not just farm seafoods, but the seafoods of San Diego. And they were able to, I think, put their cookbook out for a similar ballpark price. So that would probably be a starting off point. But I mean, if you figured about 250,000 per kind of region of the US, that might be a good way to kind of break it down to produce 4 cookbooks.
Yeah, great. Wonderful project, Mark. Thank you.
Yeah, glad you enjoyed it.
Thanks, Sebastian. Yeah, and I 100% agree that I think efforts like this go a long way towards addressing misconceptions about aquaculture. Emily, I see your hand raised. I just wanted to really quick point out, Mark, that Bree in the chat was asking if you could send a photo of the plate from the Culinary Arts Month competition. So just
Sure,
so,
sure.
just so that yeah, you noted that. But go ahead, Emily.
Yeah,
I
we'll
was
we'll
just
post
gonna.
all of that stuff on the Seafood Lovers blog,
Perfect.
and then we'll email guys directly. In fact, I'm gonna drop.
Perfect. Yeah, Emily, if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, I was kind of add a response to Sebastian. I think you're up in Maine, and then also add, maybe somebody should connect with Mark. NOAA, like what funded my position at Florida Sea Grant was a grant from NOAA purposely for aquaculture literacy in a regional scope. And so there was funding for the Southeast, which is me here in Florida. There was funding that went to California and funding that went to the Great Lakes Aquaculture Collaborative. And that started September of this last year and is a 3-year grant. So I was gonna say, Mark, you're on the West Coast, right? Like
We
Washington
are, yeah.
State. Okay, so I'm gonna drop a link in the chat, but that California Sea Grant is the one that got the West Coast Regional Aquaculture Literacy Collaborative Grant. I know they're doing like a survey of the whole region, and the second phase is to develop outreach materials. So they might just be good to reach out to and see if there's any synergies with what they're doing. Because I know you're focused on that outreach. portion. So just wanted to throw that your way.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Any other questions for the 5 minutes or so we have left?
Anybody wants to come?
If not, I would like to hear,
Oh.
Mark, oh, go ahead, Jade, if you had a question.
Just very quickly, I don't know if you can tell if I just wanted to know if freshness of the product affects Merroir somehow, or how does that affect it? Like which of the sections affects first?
Yeah, so that did come up, the kind of the fresh versus frozen. There's not a specific category in kind of the Merroir where you would put that. So I think you would put that kind of in tradition. When in the tradition kind of bubble, we looked at, was it a boutique farm, or like if we were going to talk about farming style, especially with oysters, are they single seed scatter grown? Are they seed stock grown? Are they bag tumbled? We would always talk about that in the tradition as like farming style. And so that would probably also be processing could fit under the tradition window. Um, but it's not, that those six categories aren't set in stone. If that looks like something that we could add to it as a way to describe seafood, we definitely could throw that in. And that did come up on several occasions. Like, hey, I can only get, this far or fresh or frozen. Is that going to make a difference? And when you're cooking it, of course, those kinds of things will make a difference. So we address that in the tradition bubble, but we could create a seventh bubble, I guess, for the Merroir wheel.
Thank
So
you.
Yeah,
but
good
that
question.
great suggestion.
Anyone else? I was just gonna ask if you could circle back to the anti-aquaculture person that you were able to persuade.
Yeah.
You said there was a story with that.
Yeah, so there's like three or four that come to mind. One of the first ones, so up here in the Northwest, you of course have real strong bias on salmon. You see the bumper stickers all over the place. Don't eat farm salmon. And so I've kind of gotten into it in grocery stores with the farm salmon people before. And the big one is like, well, they dye the fish, and I don't want to eat anything that's dyed. I have members of my own family, they dye it. And so when we talk about what we talked about is like, look, that well, one, you got to pick battles. If they're really against it, don't even bother because you're not going to change their mind. What you want are the people who aquaculture is bad because I heard it's bad, right? That's right, right? And we're like, well, that's all a personal preference. If you want to eat wild salmon, there's a lot to choose from. By all means, eat wild salmon is delicious. Eat it. But if you have a hard time getting it, here's some reasons why it would taste good. And here's some things to look for when you're picking a salmon. And so what the salmon one we always talked about, it's not really dyed. Yes, it's added to the feed, but what's added to the feed is what they would eat in the wild anyway. And I always bring up the example of Fraser River kings here. For whatever reason, Fraser River kings, there's a certain segment of their population that when they come out of the river, they go right to eating squid. And so even the wild ones, their meat is not that pink. It's kind of white. And that's looked at as a specialty salmon. And so I said, yeah, that color that's added, yes, it's added into their food, but it's something that's naturally added. The ones where we've really got a lot of converts, the people who are kind of not really one way or the other, is pointing out the fact that farmed bivalves and wild bivalves are pretty much identical, except some farmed bivalves, they're putting the structure out there for them to grow on, but they're in the same water that the wild bivalves are on. They're eating the same food that the wild bivalves are eating. They're harvested in basically the same way, picking them up that they're eating. And then the only difference, the big one was the oysters and how the farming actually enhanced it to create your perfect half shell oyster. Once they realized that the kind of the boutique oysters that they're paying $1.50 for a single shell at the grocery store and up to $5 per oyster in the restaurant, like, yeah, that is definitely a farm influenced oyster. Then those guys were convinced. They were like, oh, well, I like the farmed oyster. And then by giving the Merroir concepts, like you should, if you want a really mild kind of buttery flavored oyster, eat a Brady's oyster, and then you talk about where that farm is. Or if you want a nice briny, deep cupped oyster, eat a Port Madison Petite, and just dropping the names of all of these varieties of oysters that all come from different farms. And that was a big conversion to them. And then with the sablefish and the kampachi, that was a dish that a lot of people had probably never even tasted. And then getting a taste of a great farm product right off the bat, and then telling them, like we did this talk in Hawaii. Uh, in Hawaii, the Hawaiian kampachi, that fish occurs in the wild too. It's called the kahala. Nobody eats it because it's full of worms or they're high instances of ciguatera. So the one that you want is the farmed one, you know. And so that was like, oh, okay, yeah, the farmed one is better. Or if there's a long farming tradition. Hawaii has a long farming tradition with, you know, fish ponds that goes back 1,000 years. Here in the Northwest, indigenous aquaculture with clam gardens and clam farming, that had a lot of, you know, that had a lot of credibility, and it kind of presented as always, oh yeah, okay, maybe I do like that, or I'm at least not against that. And if you could get them to be at least not against it, then you could turn them and say, you know, like, why don't you, you know, you don't have to, you know, go full farm right away and just give up on all wild fish, but
Right.
just be open to it. Like eat, you know, eat whatever tastes good. Just understand that there's a lot of stuff that tastes good that you might be avoiding because you saw something on TikTok that said don't do that, you know. Give it a chance.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, no, those are all great takeaways. I'm definitely going to use those when I talk to people, but yeah, it's 1 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and call it there. But yeah, thanks to everyone for joining. Thanks again to Mark for presenting and to Lisa for setting it up. Yeah, Sebastian, yes, I think Mark dropped that, but let me go scroll back up and get that email. And then I also dropped the link to our AIE webinars group, which is where we will upload the recording of this webinar, and that's where we upload all of our recordings. So keep an eye for that. Sebastian, I just dropped Mark's email in the chat. So yeah, thanks everybody, and have a good rest of your week.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Bye.
Bye.